Okay, so now that we've posted both of our deck guides for not only the traditional Murktide builds, but the Abhorrent Oculus Unearth builds, I wanted to go through and do a little bit of it like an advanced tactics video, talk a little bit about some of the more high level plays that the deck offers, some things that people have asked about previously that we didn't really cover in the other videos. So we're just going to go like list by list. We'll start with the FrogTide list, go through some things you might not think about, and then go over to the Oculus list and kind of wrap up anything that we didn't cover in the first list. So I figure we'll just kind of start in your screen left to right, go from the lands over to the sideboard, talk about some tips and tricks for a bunch of different cards, and hopefully it'll help some things click for you. So starting off on the land side, I wouldn't worry too much about like the Darkslick Shore, Gloomlake Verge disparity. It's a little bit of what you want to have access to when, if you think Fatal Push is the most important thing to be able to do on turn one, then Darkslick Shore is a little bit better. Otherwise, Gloomlake Verge coming in untapped when you want to Murktide or Frog plus Counterspell is a pretty big deal. But what I really want to talk about is the fetch lands. Your fetch lands have a lot of utility in this deck that often goes unrecognized. Not only being able to get your Undercity Sewers, your Watery Graves, but just timing to play around Blood Moon. The breakdown of your blue versus black fetches matters when Harbinger of the Seas is something that you want access to, or if Blood Moon is something that you see yourself playing against. So the order that you play your fetch lands has a lot of importance and an impact on how the game's going to play out. Typically, you want to lead on your blue fetches earlier. It's a little more consistent if you want to get a basic island for like Counterspell than leading on a Bloodstained Mire late and or Bloodstained Mire early and having to fetch and shock to get access to that Counterspell. It also makes it so that Harbinger of the Seas is a better top deck if you save one of those black fetches and you're able to fetch up your basic swamp later. Sometimes this can get a little turned around when it comes to your Undercity Sewers, being able to get your Surveil lands early. Now, I will say, I think more often than not, you want to save your Undercity Sewers as long as you can to be able to help filter your draws when you know what you're looking for, as opposed to using them too early to just get like a generic Counterspell on top. That's not really giving you the full value of what Undercity Sewers is capable of. Wanting fetches or use fetches early for Oculus changes the equation a little bit more, but that's more on the other deck list than it is on traditional Murktide. Really, it's all about being able to set up Harbinger of the Seas, play around Blood Moon if you need to, and be able to get your Surveil lands if you don't, while also not taking too much damage from Counterspell. A lot of different things to think about when it comes to just fetching out lands. So it's kind of hard to imagine all the scenarios that the lands you play out can really impact the game. But as long as you are focusing more on like your blue fetches early, more often than not, saving your black fetches in case you need to get a swamp, you should be okay for the most part. Now, just because you have a fetch land doesn't mean you have to crack it. We are a 3 or 4 basic deck, so you don't have to fetch up a tapped Watery Grave whenever you're not using your fetch or whenever you don't have anything you need to do. So you do have some utility from keeping fetches uncracked, especially if you're playing against an opponent that has interaction that they might be able to respond to your fetch to. A lot of times it's better just to go to your turn, like play out another land, pass, fetch on the next turn with mana open or something like that, instead of trying to just fetch to thin the deck. Is that about it for the mana base? I guess I'll briefly talk about matchups. Usually you know pretty quickly if Harbinger of the Seas is going to be relevant in that particular matchup. So if it is, I'd often try your best to keep a black fetch in hand in case you find the Harbinger. I know previously a lot of players have been kind of high on the idea of being able to play out Harbinger with no black mana available and kind of ride the blue to victory. I don't think it's quite the same anymore as it used to be. Back when it was Murktide, Counterspell, Archmage's Charm, Harbinger, you could kind of get away with that. But now with Deluge, Shoot the Sheriff, Psychic Frog, Fatal Push, like so much more of your game plan relies on having access to black mana. If you're on the Oculus build, you can get away with it a little bit more, but if you're not on Oculus, it's pretty rough. So yeah, I guess that'll cover it for the lands. We'll come back with the next tip. Okay, moving on to the 1 mana interaction. Not too much to say here. Like Preordain can be really good for setting up Psychic Frog draws, which I feel like I don't see people do enough. A lot of times they'll hit with frogs, see what they draw, and then Preordain. But usually when you get to a point where you have a Psychic Frog out and it's living and attacking, like your entire game plan shifts to find counter spells. And if you preordain before the draw, you give yourself a better chance of like filtering Wasteland Dead, finding a counter spell if it's not in the top 2, maybe digging to a second counter spell if you find one off preordain and draw into another. But it just gives you a few more chances when you know what you're looking for. Kind of the same thing with fetching up Undercity Sewers before you attack in with a frog, which I probably could have added that to the land part. If you hit your opponent with a frog, or if you want to Undercity Sewers to filter a frog draw, usually the best practice is to hit with the frog and then with the trigger on the stack, fetch up the Undercity Sewers. That way you know you're going to get to draw the card. You know that frog's connecting. If you Undercity Sewers before you like attack or before to go to combat, then you might put something on top that you don't necessarily need, thinking that the frog is going to survive. Then if your opponent interacts with it, you might lose out on your ability to get rid of that card on top. So fetching up an Undercity Sewers with the frog combat damage trigger on the stack. Nice little practice. Preordain before combat. Cling to Dust. Cling to Dust has got a lot of utility that I don't think people realize. For one, not only can you target your own spells in the graveyard to like grow a Murktide Regent, but if you escape Cling to Dust, then Cling to Dust itself leaves the graveyard, goes onto the stack. That triggers Murktide. So you get a counter from casting the Cling to Dust, even if you didn't exile any spells. And then you can target something that you use to pay for Cling to Dust. So if you got Cling to Dust and 5 other cards in your yard, so Cling to Dust 5 cards, you can cast the Cling to Dust, target one of the 5 cards that you use to pay for the Cling, escape it. It'll fizzle. You won't get to draw a card or gain any life or anything, but it can be nice if you just have like a small graveyard, need to pump a Murktide, or you want to Cling to Dust to take something out of your yard so your opponent can't Ghost Vacuum you or can't like Surgical Extraction, things like that. Otherwise, Cling to Dust is like a pretty decent little redraw with Psychic Frog, so you can always Cling to Dust before you decide if you want to discard the frog, see if you draw something live or not, instead of just discarding the Cling to Dust. We'll hop over to the FrOculus build. There's definitely a point I want to make here with the 1-drops and the eye builds. Mainly Thought Scour and Consider. Kind of the same thing I said about if you want to fetch up an Undercity Sewers, usually doing it after you get the combat trigger with Frog is best. These 1 mana instant speed Cantrips are really good at the end of your opponent's turn. Same thing with Undercity Sewers. It's also a situation where you don't want to see Undercity Sewers off of your Thought Scour or Consider. So what you can do to prevent that to some extent is fetch up your Undercity Sewers with the Surveil trigger on the stack, then you cast your Thought Scour, your Consider. The reason this is kind of optimal is if you Consider or Thought Scour first, you run the risk of milling over, like having your Undercity Sewers on top, you mill it over, and then that fetch land that you wanted to crack is kind of dead now. But if you let the Undercity Sewers Surveil resolve and you see something that you want on top and then you Consider, you can draw into that, but you don't get the full value of Consider. Or if you Thought Scour or have Thought Scour, now you have to target your opponent or wait until your turn. And a lot of decks in Modern right now, like, you don't want to be targeting your opponent with Flage and opposing Unearth decks and Murktide and stuff like that. So it can be a liability if you wait, but if you let the Surveil trigger, if you fetch up the Surveil land, let the trigger go on the stack, then cast your Cantrip, you're always going to be drawing into the card either you see or the blind draw of Thought Scour, and then you have your Surveil. You'll have a known or flipped card on top. So you got the full effect from your Cantrip and the full effect from your Undercity Sewers in the same in-step. Anything about Unearth? Really, with Unearth, it's just about like being mana efficient. If you have the chance to Unearth an Oculus or a Frog or something and hold up interaction, a lot of times it can be better than just like hard casting the thing. So if you have a Frog out and Oculus in hand, 6 cards in your yard, 3 mana available where you could just hard cast the Oculus, that might be really tempting to kind of save the Unearth. But if you're able to discard the Oculus and Unearth it and hold up like Counterspell, Spell Snare or something, then I would typically go that route. Just being able to do a little bit more, plus you get the counter on the Frog. Because if you don't cast that Unearth, there's a pretty decent chance it's just going to go dead, like sitting around in hand. So if you have the chance to cast it while being more mana efficient, then that's a much better proposition. Any other 1-drops? I don't think so. So we'll be right back with the 2s. Okay, 2-drops. Counterspell, pretty known quantity. The Doomblade effects, I think you've all heard at some point or another that Shoot the Sheriff misses Ragavan, Dolthy Voidwalker. Go for the Throat misses like Urza Saga tokens, Kappa Cannoneer, Scion of Draco. It's not like a huge list one way or the other. Kind of go with what you feel comfortable with. Some people I know will try Bitter Triumph and the new 1 in a black like Stack of Food or Exile 3 cards one. Honestly, I'm not a fan of those last 2 whatsoever, because I think when they're good, they're fine. But when they're bad, like they're pretty bad. People, I think, really want to mitigate the downside and make the upside look better than it actually is. For example, with Bitter Triumph, you see a lot of times, you discard an Oculus to get to Unearth it, and okay, that's cool occasionally, or you get to cast the other ones, Feed the Swarm. I don't even know what the name of it is. It's the Bloomburrow one. You get to exile some cards and grow your Murktide. Well, you just had a Murktide that was like surviving, and you had instants and sorceries in the yard, so you probably could have just cast that Murktide bigger. But either way, if you choose to play one of the off-brand ones, just know that you need to be keeping an eye on like how high the upside is versus how low the floor actually is. Orcish Bowmaster. This is a card that I think is like extraordinarily overhyped. We kind of got into a point in Modern where any of the decks that are running the One Ring, especially if there's something like Boros or Mardu Energy, if they untap, play a One Ring, and you play a Bowmaster, and they draw, you maybe ping down an X1, maybe you don't. You can't attack in the next turn. Then the turn after they go to crack it or draw again, you might get a couple pings off Bowmaster and you're going to be like, oh God, this card's so good. It shuts down the One Ring, until they just like discharge your Bowmaster and it kind of all goes away. It's just not a very resilient threat. And the decks that are playing the One Ring have got so many ways of dealing with it that you run the risk of it just not closing things out. Or you play against something like Tron that has a ring on turn 2. You play out your Bowmaster, you feel great, and then they just like turn 3 kick a Myco spawn, or turn 4 Devourer of Destiny your Bowmaster, and then tap the ring again. And it just doesn't outvalue the game. Like, Bowmaster had a really good time in the meta with Up the Beanstalk, because a lot of times you could respond to the Beanstalk, ping, they'd cast an Evoke Elemental, you'd ping, leave behind a body. Maybe if you stop the Evoke Elemental, then you're talking about like 1 or 2 more pings and Bowmaster really getting out of hand. But their removal spells cause them to take Bowmaster triggers. But with the One Ring, like that first activation, Bowmaster just doesn't do anything. It's 1 damage somewhere. And then after that, like the 2-3 damage just doesn't keep up with the cards that they're drawing off the One Ring and the options that they have available. So just be careful on thinking that Bowmaster is like this end all be all card. Psychic Frog. Oh, Psychic Frog. This is definitely a question I get all the time. Like, how do you know when to go in on Psychic Frog? How do you know when to hold off? What's the telltale sign if it's a matchup that you need to be like all on board the Rivet train? And the easy answer is there's just not a good answer to that. The hard answer is depends on what you can do if you're wrong. So if I'm playing Frog up against like Boros Energy, one of the most popular matchups in Modern, and I play a Frog on my turn 2, they untap, they go to their turn 2. I'm assuming I'm on the play because I lost game 1, you know. So I go to their turn 2, and my opponent leads with a Galvanic Discharge. No energy in the pool, just Galvanic Discharge. I'm looking at my hand and saying, okay, do I have 2 cards I can afford to just throw away to kind of call their bluff and make them have another piece of interaction? And these might be extra cards in the form of like another Frog, or maybe a Spell Pierce or something that's really not doing anything for me. If I can afford to throw away this first 2 cards, and if I'm wrong, if they have another piece of interaction, that's fine. I'm okay with that trade. Then I'll go in. If I've got like Force and Negation blue card and a couple dead cards, that's perfect, because then I'm discarding these 2 to the discharge and hoping you follow it up with like a Static Prison or something and forcing that. And I'd feel kind of okay. If I think that discarding anything in my hand is going to cause me to lose the game if I'm wrong, then I'm not throwing it away. They can just have the Frog. Obviously, the type of interaction they use changes a little bit here and there. So if they do go for like a Tarfire, I'm a lot more likely to just throw something away. If they go for a Lightning Bolt, I'm a little more likely something that's like not accruing them value, like they can't just stockpile away the energy if they can't stockpile away the energy if they choose not to spend it, because Lightning Bolt doesn't give them energy. Things like that. Against a lot of the matchups like Eldrazi, I'll try to meet midway, go in a little bit on the Frog to reduce the clock substantially. If I can get the clock from 20 turns down to 5 turns, that's a really big improvement. If I go all in on Frog, I run the risk of my opponent just having like a couple 2 soul lands and something, and now all of a sudden I got to fight over Kozilek's command into turn, untap Devourer, and that frog's not very long for the world. If it's a matchup like Ruby Storm, I'm really likely to throw everything that's not a counterspell into the frog and just saying, I'm going to put you on like a 3-turn clock and keep my 1 counterspell or my spell snare, my spell pierce, and say good luck. Those I think like Ruby Storm and Belcher are really about the only matchups that I will go all in on a frog without anything else going on. Anything else from the Oculus build on 2? Nope, not particularly. So we'll head on to the 3s. Oh, the 3s. The 3s, especially in the Oculus builds, are where it gets kind of wild. So first off, Oculus itself. Obviously, the card is really, really good if you're able to discard it early or Thought Scour over it and unearth it ahead of schedule. Super, super huge value engine to have access to. Great at eventually refilling your yard. They're usually, the game's over one way or the other before you really have time to put a lot of resources into your yard. So I wouldn't treat Oculus as like this go long grindy card in the deck. It's really a turn 2 combo or turn 3 like frog discard it, unearth plus counterspell combo, and you're closing out the game in like 3 turns from there. So if you're expecting Oculus to be flip over and fill the yard up for Snapcaster, fill the yard up for Murktide, whatever the case may be, that's not it. Like, Oculus by itself is just swinging in the air 3-4 times and killing your opponent. And if you're planning for longer than that, you're just kind of like wasting the entire unearth potential. Now you can go a little heavier on the hard casting Oculus plan. For example, having Thought Scour, Thought Seize, Consider, stuff like that over things like Bowmaster to be able to fill up the yard more proactively to hard cast Oculus on 3. And I think that plan's actually very reasonable. I would go higher up on like Force Negation if you do, but hard casting Oculus with Force backup or Subtlety backup, something like that, is a reasonable plan of attack. And I do think has a lot of unexplored potential. I really like Thought Seize in the Oculus builds a lot. And let's skip on down. I think this one I swap back, but something like Thought Seize over Bowmaster to help proactively fill the yard, or you can always Thought Seize yourself and set up an unearth on an Oculus. I think that you really need to lean in one way or the other if you're going for discard and unearth, or if you're going for hard cast Oculus. I don't think you can really afford to be too split. But either way, let's talk about the manifest dread with Oculus. So depending on the deck you're playing, the list you're playing, there's going to be different times that you want to manifest different cards. So for example, if I'm playing an Oculus build with Murktide, more often than not, whenever I see a spell, I want to put it into the graveyard because I want it for Murktide. The more Murktides I'm running, the more I want to put those spells in the graveyard. The fewer Murktides I'm running, and especially if I've already like Thought Scoured over my Murktides or Oculus over my Murktides, then I want to switch gears and start putting lands and creatures, not necessarily creatures you can unearth if you have unearth, but mostly lands into the graveyard and keep your spells face down. That way your opponent doesn't have the chance to start mathing out what you could have. So for example, if I've used 2 counter spells and Oculus flips over a counter spell and a land, and I put that counter spell in the graveyard for Murktide, I run the risk of my opponent recognizing, okay, that's 3 counter spells gone. The likelihood of them having another counter spell is pretty low. So I'm just going to jam this thing. And that can be kind of tough for a deck that gets a lot of EV from bluffing. So if you're not playing Murktide, it's usually better to just like throw the spells face down, throw your lands and stuff in the graveyard. That way your opponent can have no additional clue of what could be in your hand. But like I said, the more Murktides you're running, the more likely it is you want to put the spell in the graveyard and whatever the land is face down. If you can play the creature, or if it's a creature that you can flip face up off Oculus, then that's really good to have access to. But there are going to be some times where you want to flip the creature into the graveyard because you have Unearth and the ability to Unearth plus hold up interaction, where if you had to actually turn the card face up, you might have to pay more than you can afford to also keep up your interaction. For example, if you have 3 lands, an Unearth, and a counter spell, and you flip over a Psychic Frog and something else, you might want to just put the Psychic Frog in the yard, go to your next turn, Unearth it, hold up counter spell, instead of paying the mana to flip the frog up and hope you have enough to get in an attack, draw another card, play another land, and hold up counter spell. Because if you don't Unearth the frog, then kind of like I mentioned before, there's a chance that that Unearth just goes dead sitting around in hand. So using it to be proactive and efficient is better than not using it just to have it sit around in hand. Force of Negation, not really a lot of tips and tricks with Force. A lot of times I'll use it pretty aggressively if I have a Frog or an Oculus out, like something that can run away with the game. And I'll use it more reactively if I'm waiting to find a threat. So things like play a turn 2 Frog. My opponent plays a turn 2 Talisman out of one of the Eldrazi decks. I'm more likely to force that because I've got the Frog down, and I'm more likely to redraw into something good or another counter spell. But if I don't have the Frog or Oculus down, I'm more likely to let that resolve and just save it for like a 1 ring. Or if I've got an Oculus down, need to hard cast an Oculus, more likely to aggressively force something that I wouldn't otherwise because I have a clock on board that's going to start closing things out a lot quicker. Sink into Stupor. Another card I think is pretty undervalued. I like running 2 Sink more often than not. I know this list on screen's only got 1, but basically every FrogTide build I run has at least 2. I think the card gets a lot of value when you're wanting to play around things like Cavern of Souls with Primeval Titan, or acting as like a late game counter spell against things like the One Ring. So really like having access to it. It's also really good into like opposing Murktides. Harbinger of the Seas. Harbinger is a very, very tricky one because I think a lot of times people mess up by like telegraphing that they have a Harbinger. So you'll see things, for example, turn 1, fetch up an Undercity Sewers. Turn 2, fetch up a basic swamp, play a frog. Turn 3, fetch up a basic island, play a Harbinger. But because they got that basic swamp on 2, now their opponent's like, oh, they have a Harbinger, or I need to think about Harbinger. Let me try to play around it a bit. When in reality, they could have done something like turn 1, Undercity Sewers. Turn 2, Bolton, Sink into Stupor. Turn 3, fetch up basic swamp and Harbinger. Or I've gotten some people by going turn 1, whatever land, turn 2, whatever land, turn 3 could slam a Harbinger, but my opponent's got a fetch land open. So instead, I just play a fetch and pass, and they into my turn go for a Surveil land, untap, don't have a basic on their turn, pass back, or cast something, pass back, and I get to slam a Harbinger that turn after because I didn't play it out into the basic. With Modern nowadays, there's so many Surveil lands going around and trial lands going around that if you don't do anything, there's a really good chance your opponent's just going to search out for one of those. And if you let them have that one extra piece, especially if you've got a piece of interaction for their turn, then there's a really good chance you can go to your next turn, slam Harbinger, and it'll just close out the game. Now that does have a little bit of wiggle room, like depending on what they have available. For example, if you're playing against Zoo and your opponent's got 2 tapped lands and an untapped white fetch, then you've got to weigh, oh, do I want to play this Harbinger? They can't get rid of it into turn, because if they get a plains, unless they have a ley line of the guild pack, then logic and reason goes out the window. But at the end of my turn, if they get a plains, then they can't ley line binding because they only have plains island. So they go to their turn, they'd have to play 4th land, tap out completely, play the binding, and they could get rid of my Harbinger, but they spent their entire 4th turn doing so. If I have a force negation, then that's even better for me if I can force keep my Harbinger around and they just wasted a whole turn. So do have to be a little bit considerate. And there are going to be hands that you can slam a Harbinger on 3, even if you don't have black mana and win. But like I said, it's a lot less likely than it used to be, and you have to be really careful about what that hand is. For example, if you've got Harbinger, Spell Pierce, Spell Snare, I don't know, Bowmaster, Fatal Push, that hand's probably not winning, especially if they do something like Cast of Wondering. But if you've got Harbinger, Counterspell, Murktide, Preordain, yeah, that hand's winning by locking both opponents out of everything but blue. So it's not something you have to do just because you have Harbinger on 3. Don't like risk locking yourself out just to shut down whatever your opponent's got going on. Also against decks like opposing Murktide mirrors, blue-black mirrors. Shutting your opponent off of black mana can be extremely effective, like stopping them from being able to Fatal Push or shoot the Sheriff your Harbinger, can't Bowmaster, can't cast Psychic Frogs. Really big deal. Less good against the Oculus versions, but it is pretty solid against the traditional Murktide builds. The Oculus builds, just being able to hard cast Oculus itself a lot easier, is a little rougher, and they can like cycle Unearths and things. Is that it for the 3s? Toxic Deluge. If you want to run Deluge in the main, I think it's perfectly reasonable. I just don't think it's going to be like a lights out card. Like you see that first Deluge against Boros, and it's usually okay, but it's not game ending. So just know that going ahead or going into it. We'll come back with some of the more expensive stuff and then get on to the sideboards. So for the more expensive cards in the decks, it's really limited to like Murktide Regent, Subtlety, Curiosity, seen a little bit, and kind of it. Like every now and then I get an urge to cast a Shield Druid, but I haven't yet. But really, Murktide Regent. The only big tip I can give for Murktide is if you're running a bunch of them, so like you're running 3 or 4 copies of Murktide, then a lot of the times it's going to be right to not go all in on that first one. Maybe you exile a couple spells just to make sure that Murktide is a relevant clock. But a lot of decks nowadays have an answer to that first Murktide. So being able to play out the first one, present a clock, then if it's dealt with, still cast a second one that's fairly sizable is a nice little sequence to have access to. Also, if you do need to like up the clock on the Murktide, make sure you cast the second one pre-combat. I mess up from time to time thinking, okay, well I want to attack with the Murktide first and like cast my spells second main, when I should have just cast the second Murktide. And if it gets killed or countered, whatever, I have another Murktide. So just keep an eye out for not being proactive when you need to be proactive. I think is the best way I can explain that one. Subtlety is not a card that I'm a big fan of, because a lot of times it's like, oh, you cast Subtlety or you evoke Subtlety to put their escaped Flage back on top, or you evoke Subtlety on their Ajani or whatever, and like you still have to deal with that thing next turn. Flage is a little bit better, but you still have to go down 2 cards to deal with that when you could have just like counterspelled it or Archmage's Charmed it or something like that. I just don't like the idea of a counter spell that you have to go down cards on to still have to deal with the thing like the next turn, the following turn. There is obviously some scenarios where it looks really good. For example, if you get to hard cast it into a Murktide Regent to prevent it from resolving, or they go to Escape Flage, you get to hard cast the Subtlety, even though they can just like put the Flage on top, cast it, and kill your Subtlety the next turn. But especially into like Murktide Regent, it's a little bit better. But nowadays with Mystical Dispute and things like that, the chances of that Subtlety resolving are kind of low, unless you want to go Subtlety plus Force plus blue card. And yeah, I just don't want to go down that many resources when I would rather fight over the Murktide with an actual counter spell or shoot the Sheriff or something like that. Any other big stuff? Mentioned Shieldred. We've seen Murktide lists with like the 1 ring every now and then. If you're not expecting a bunch of Boros, you could jam some 1 rings, but I would not go anywhere not expecting Boros. Curiosity, Enduring Curiosity is one that I really like. I don't think we are in a Enduring Curiosity meta by any chance, but maybe like some build with Curiosity and Oculus and Bowmasters, I think could have some kind of fun potential. I've been playing it a little bit in Standard. Really fun card. But who knows? Maybe that'll pick up some steam eventually. If we see like the 1 ring band and something outside of Boros, things slow down a little bit, then Enduring Curiosity could be a really fun one to jump on the bandwagon of. That's about it for the main deck. Let's get into the sideboard. I wasn't really sure how I wanted to approach the sideboard stuff. We've already got the matchup guide out, so you gotta know like what to bring in different matchups. So I'll try to go through like some corner cases with some popular cards, and maybe that'll help to give you some ideas. So first off, Mystical Dispute. There's a very fun scenario that comes out a decent amount of the time in like blue mirrors with Mystical Dispute, where you can set up like a time walk kind of tap out turn if your opponent casts something that you don't really care if it resolves, but you can Mystical Dispute when they have the 3 mana to pay for it. And a lot of times they'll just say, okay, well, I can pay for it, so I'm just going to pay. And if they want to spend another counter spell on it, then great. I got 2 cards out of hand. But really, you just wanted them to tap off of mana so that you could resolve something on your turn. So you'll see it from time to time with things like, oh, my opponent played a Murktide Regent. They have 5 mana. Cool. I'm going to Mystical Dispute. They're going to pay the 3, resolve their Murktide. I go to my turn. I resolve a bigger Murktide. Or I go to my turn and I go for a, what's it called? Shoot the Sheriff. They force. I spell pierce their force and then resolve a big Murktide. Stuff like that is really fun to have access to. Happens with spell pierce every now and then as well, but Mystical Dispute, just paying that extra mana is a lot more noticeable in those situations. Stern Scolding. There's big overlap in the things that you want to Stern Scolding and you want to Spell Snare. For example, cards like a Johnny, Amped Raptor, some of the stuff out of these Soul Trader decks, like opposing Bowmasters or Marionette Apprentice, things like that. More often than not, I lean towards wanting to Stern Scolding more aggressively against Boros. So like if they play a 2-drop like in a Johnny or an Amped Raptor, if I've got a Stern Scolding and a Spell Pierce, or Stern Scolding and a Spell Snare in hand, I more likely would want a Stern Scolding against Boros. That way I can hit a Goblin Bombardment or something like that with Spell Snare if it comes down, while also hitting another Johnny, another Raptor. Against decks like Soul Trader, I'm more likely to want to Spell Snare the first one that comes down. That way I can save that Stern Scolding for a 1-mana value creature like a Delighted Halfling or a Yawgmoth or something like that I couldn't Stern Scolding, or I couldn't Spell Snare. They could have, what's it called? Birthing Rituals, something like that. If they have more Birthing Rituals, more Cauldrons, then that kind of flips around. It goes back towards the same way Boros does, where I'm more likely to want to Stern Scolding first. But you kind of have to take it by ear based off what their general configurations have been like or what you've seen so far. Consigned to Memory. Consigned being there like 95% for Tron. The other 5% I would almost say for just like Zoo and Charbelcher. But Tron mostly, and I really don't believe Consigned to Memory is enough to be decent against Tron, even if you're on like 4 consigns. I think you have to have Consigned plus Break the Ice or Consigned plus Thoughtseize. Because especially now these like mono green ramp builds of Eldrazi, you're more likely to see not only like Kozilek's Command at instant speed and the Sowing Myco spawns, but also Devourer of Destinies and Big Emrakuls and the One Rings. And Consign is just going to get overloaded extraordinarily quickly if you don't have a really good clock on. So Consign plus Break the Ice, Consign plus Thoughtseize. And I really do think Break the Ice is the best pairing to go with Consign, because taking out a Soul Land can set them back a really good bit. But if you just want to go with like the Thoughtseize plan, they can still cast all of their big things. I prefer ways that like stop them from casting the big things to begin with, because that puts less strain on Consigned to Memory to have to replicate to deal with a lot of those big cast triggers. But that's mostly a personal preference. If you are having success without Break or Thoughtseize, or if you're finding some other tech useful, then definitely run that. Toxic Deluge, pretty straightforward. Ghost Vacuum is an interesting one. Seeing it pop up in sideboards here and there. Really, I think the only 2 matchups that I want Ghost Vacuum against are the Dimir mirrors, especially against the Unearth builds, but against like all of the Dimir matchups. And Goryo's Vengeance. It can be decent against things like Soul Trader decks to snap off Grave Crawlers, but if it's not Nihil Spellbomb or like Unlicensed Hearse or a higher quality Grave Hate piece, I don't think it's as good in those matchups. But being a good value Grave Hate piece against Goryo's Vengeance and Dimir is pretty solid. Just watch out against Goryo's Vengeance. You don't want to like play it out on turn 1 and your opponent just prismatic endings it and you're kind of done for the day. So try to save it at least a couple turns where you can either protect it or tag something right away. They can't immediately Goryo's. Nihil Spellbomb. I still think Unlicensed Hearse is like my favorite piece of Grave Hate, generically speaking. But we are seeing a lot of Delirium decks running around. Jund Delirium, Shifting Woodlands decks, stuff like that. So having access to a way to nuke an entire graveyard is pretty important. And I would also make sure you know like what the priority opportunities are on something like Nihil Spellbomb. For example, if your opponent's got 4 cards in their yard, 2 lands on the battlefield, and you pass, and they just shock in a land, cast a Murktide, there's nothing you can do about it. So if that's not something you can beat at that moment, not something you can interact with, know that you need to crack that spell bomb proactively. Or if your opponent's got 6, 7 cards in their yard, 4 lands on the battlefield, and they draw and play a fetch land. Let's say you're against Boros and they fetch up a Surveil land. If they flip over a Flage, you don't get a priority opportunity if they just immediately cast a Flage. So know if that's something you can deal with or not going into their turn, instead of just like waiting, letting things play out, and all of a sudden your opponent's flipped over a Flage off their Surveil land, they're escaping it, and you ran out of an opportunity to crack a spell bomb. I would almost always take the extra card and being more proactive cracking spell bomb than being too passive and letting them resolve a 5/5 Murktide or whatever and kind of running away with that. In the traditional builds, not really much changes from a sideboarding perspective. Is there anything in any of these others? Graveyard Trespasser has been a pretty fun one. It's been solid for me. The few leagues that I have played it, definitely recommend it if you're looking for like a value-oriented kind of Grave Hate card. So similar to Ghost Vacuum, but less combo and more, I'm going to hit you in the face with this. Really good against like Boros and the Dimir mirrors. It is a little pricey, so don't be wrong there. The Mystical Disputes we went over, Consign, Stern Scolding, Deluge. Yeah, I think that's about it. Hopefully this gives you a decent little reference to look back on for ways to approach different cards in your deck, different situations that'll come up pretty often, and kind of help you think through those scenarios a little bit better. Just remember that whenever any of these spots come up, a lot of times you can come to the right answer by yourself by just like stopping whatever you're doing and thinking for an extra moment before you start making any plays. I think when people get in trouble, it's when they go with a just have to do something mentality instead of the, okay, well, let me take a breath and try to figure out the right thing to do. If the sequence is a little more nuanced than I originally thought, then maybe I just want to hold off half a second, wait and see if some other line pops out to me. It can really help in the early turns of the game when you're thinking, okay, I've got Gloom Lake Verge, an island, and a polluted delta. And I played my Gloom Lake Consider or Gloom Lake Preordain on turn 1. And turn 2, I really want to fetch out an Undercity Sewers. But if my opponent if I play out my fetch and my opponent makes me counterspell something, then I just lost access to my Undercity Sewers. So just playing out my island turn 2 means I can't Undercity Sewers into turn, but at least I know I get to do that eventually. Can save you a lot of frustration in the long run. So yeah, hope this video helps you out a little bit. Hopefully makes you run through your next RCQ. I know quite a few like moments in here were kind of rambling, but there are a lot of moments with the deck that are hard to explain what the optimal play is. As always, I kind of recommend you jump into the leagues, give the deck a shot, try out some different configurations, see what works for you. But if you're unsure of the direction you want to go, as always, links down below to the matchup guides for traditional Murktide and for Oculus. So hopefully those will help you out, as well as links to the Discord if you want to come talk about any lines or any builds you're looking at. Link to the Twitch in case you want to check out a live stream. Twitter, first place it gets updated when a live stream is happening. And yeah, that's about all I got. If you're enjoying the videos, feel free to leave a like and follow. Definitely helps the growth on the channel. Other than that, Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your evening. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.